So work from a trauma-informed care perspective. Look at self-care strategies. Now, we talked a little bit about that in MHS001. There's a bit of crossover there, and you'll notice some of the slides at the end are the same, but it would be healthy to refresh and just touch again on self-care strategies and what you do to look after yourself. And contribute to the continuous improvement of trauma-informed care in services. So the third one of those is about how do you make your organisation more trauma aware and providing trauma-informed care, changing systems, etc. So this unit's about the skills and knowledge required to practice and contribute to the continuous improvement of trauma-informed care services within a service, trauma-informed care within a service. It applies to individuals working in community services and health, which is you guys, where services are informed by the knowledge and understanding of central trauma, particularly impact of interpersonal violence. So interpersonal violence is violence between people. So the session outline, we're going to define what trauma is. We're going to look at common reactions experienced during trauma. We're going to look at what complex trauma is, the effects of complex trauma, trauma and the brain. So there'll be another brain diagram for you. Coping strategies, trigger of trauma, what triggers it? What is vicarious trauma or vicarious trauma, trauma-informed care and self-care. So, understanding trauma. Trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience that causes psychological injury or pain. So you might get a physical injury. And when I used to work in child protection and teach in child protection, I often used to talk about somebody can give you a black eye or a broken arm. You might get it in a football game. That has a context. A black eye or a bruised arm, broken arm from your father, they might also have a context, but there's the emotional trauma that goes with it. So you get over the physical injury, pardon me, but you don't always get over the psychological injury, and you certainly have to process the psychological injury now. It gets complicated. It gets complicated in terms of if your father broke your arm once and you understood why that happened. Not that it's an appropriate thing to do, but that would give it more of a context than it happening regularly, or it happening when you weren't expecting it to happen. You're never sure why you got the punishment that you got. So all those things can impact on your emotional safety and your emotional stability. But in any case, any of those sorts of violent injuries will leave psychological injury. They will traumatize the person, which is why we call it trauma. So being bullied at school and the workplace online is one way that people are affected by trauma, and we all have either personal experience or know of people who've been bullied, and for longer or shorter periods, some of us have experienced it. Being abused either by a partner, by friends, by teachers, by managers, by fellow workmates, in public. I was walking down the street in George Street many years ago with a friend of mine, a Singaporean friend who wore glasses, and we had beer bottles that were literally thrown in front of us and smashed in front of us. We were left under no illusion as to why that happened. I was told for us to go home, you four-eyed geek. That was abuse, pure and simple, and it wasn't expected, and it wasn't called for, but it can be anything from that through to significant physical abuse at the hands of somebody else, or verbal abuse, or emotional, or spiritual, or financial abuse in a domestic violence context, where you're not given access to resources or they're controlled, etc. Seeing something violent. So if you witness something violent, that can be traumatic. A couple of years ago, the Lint Cafe siege, I went to work that morning, and I have to go to the NZ Bridge. I used to have to go to the NZ Bridge to go to work, and there were so many sirens, I wasn't sure what was going on, but I found out that the Lint Cafe siege was happening. It was still going when I got home. Obviously, it was going to 2 o'clock in the morning when they stormed in and fired guns. Because my partner was on night shift, I was actually up at 2 o'clock watching on TV. I can see the city from my lounge room pretty much. So in the city that I could see, I was watching on television somebody being given CPR to try and revive them, which ended up being the woman that died. And so I saw people literally, I saw the bullets literally being fired and people being brought out alive or dead. So that was live television, and that to me was something that was on the ABC. So that for me was a new phenomenon in terms of television. And because I've been following it all day and because I live close by, I felt some vicarious trauma around it. It took me a few days to process it. I wouldn't say that I was traumatized by it, but I saw something violent and I had to process it. You can see something violent in a movie and have to process it. I saw Seven many years ago, and because I used to drive clients around and they'd sit in the back seat, there's a scene in Seven that was quite disturbing for me, and it took me some time to get over that movie as well. Needless to say, I haven't seen Wolf Creek, but I know people who have. But seeing something violent in person, particularly somebody that you care about, is going to dramatically increase your trauma. I had a colleague was bitten by a client while wrestling on the ground. So that was something violent that I saw, but that was also the result of that colleague overstepping the mark and how they handled that client, and that led to that client being stressed, and then that was the consequence because they felt trapped on the ground by this person, and that was reliving trauma. So in terms of this unit, in terms of trauma-informed care, if we'd had trauma-informed care in that situation, then the client wouldn't have ended up on the ground and he wouldn't have been on top of her with his knees on her shoulders, for instance. I think that's, from memory, that's how it panned out. But seeing something violent can lead to trauma. Having said all that, when the Lynch siege comes, I have a colleague who had worked in London for a long time, and she said that she just got used to that sort of stuff because you'd be on a bus and it would get hijacked. So she was pretty blasé about it all. So you can become numb to trauma if you've experienced a lot of it. You might not feel safe in your neighbourhood. Now, that's going to depend on where you live to some extent. I have some friends from Colombia who talk about zones. So Zone 6 is extremely unsafe and Zone 1 is okay. We don't really have Zone 6s in Australia, but we certainly have some suburbs where people would feel less safe. But safety is also a perception. I have a neighbour when I grew up in Panania and moved back there to look after Dad for a period of time as he got dementia. And the woman next door, who I've known since I was a child, basically, confided one day that she doesn't walk in the neighbourhood. She walks around the backyard, around her husband's car, basically, because she didn't feel safe to go walking in the streets in the morning or the night time or any time of the day. I thought that was a little bit over the top in terms of the suburb because it doesn't really have a reputation for being rough. It's perhaps become a little bit rougher in recent years, but so sometimes it's perception and sometimes it's a reality. There's certainly other suburbs that people wouldn't feel comfortable to walk around in, and the suburbs in Sydney that I wouldn't necessarily walk around in without needing to. And when I'm in New York, I don't go to the Bronx, for instance, as a tourist. If I had to go there for something like business, I would go, but and obviously it's changed quite a bit. But I think as soon as you put yourself, in fact, when we were in New York last time, we pulled in to get petrol at a place called Jamaica Beach, and for a moment we thought we were going to get shot because we're just getting petrol, but it's a particularly unsafe sort of suburb. Being exposed to something bad that happened to a loved one. So again, seeing something that has happened to somebody else and you feel you can't do anything about. And living through a disaster like a bad accident, a fire or a hurricane. Obviously the bushfires recently, the floods, cyclones, living through a car crash or living through a bus crash or a plane crash, for instance, or being the only survivor from a building collapse. Stuart Diver in the Thredbo building collapse, that would have been, he's lived through that trauma. He lost his partner and was the only person to survive in the building that he was in. So that's trauma in itself. Any thoughts on that? Any examples of obviously losing a loved one, which I haven't covered?
It could be obviously, like going through a natural disaster, serious natural disaster, for example. Sorry, I can't hear you for some reason.
You can't hear me?
Oh, there you go.
Yep, that's right. Natural disasters are, and often one of the things about natural disasters is often you've got a communal sort of trauma. So you've got the Healesville community and trying to think of the other town in Victoria that had the big bushfires, and then you've got Cobargo and all the south coast where people have lived through bushfires recently. And we're united as a town. I mean, ScoMo certainly copped not a very friendly welcome when you visited, for instance. So you can have a lot of trauma, and you can have that trauma can help that whole town heal, or it can help that town maintain the rage almost. Like sometimes it works positively, sometimes it doesn't work so positively, but definitely you can. I guess with COVID, there's a little bit of trauma around COVID in terms of the change of life. It depends on how people adjust to that. And neighbours are having a collective sort of getting together because they can't really go out. So there's a whole range of ways that it might play out. Any other examples before I move on?
I suppose the only exposure wasn't really trauma, but was more of an experience. Back in 1999, the hailstorm that came through the eastern suburbs of Sydney.
Yep.
It sort of, it was quite impactful where, there was a lot of hail, and there was a particular acquaintance or a friend of mine who sort of said, look, my car was damaged quite severely. And I thought, oh, well, there was a lot of cars that were damaged quite severely. He said, yeah, but the difference with mine was actually parked in the garage at the time. So the hailstones had gone through the roof and damaged the roof of the garage, and ultimately then damaged the roof of his car because the hailstones were the size of, almost baseballs or, whatever size they came down at. So didn't impact me, but the stories of, stuff like that where the hailstones damaged severely someone's home, it was quite impactful.
Yeah, and that's the thing. The neighbours that I was talking about before, he had a Datsun Ute that was his pride and joy, and we had a hailstorm back. It would have been well back before. It would have been in the late 70s, early 80s, and there was hail damaged cars all over Sydney, and he was quite distraught about. So that led to him every time there was any threat of a hailstorm was to find somebody's garage so they could put it in. Obviously, in that hailstorm that you talked about, that wouldn't have helped, but yeah, it can certainly change people's behaviours as a result of what's happened. And people can be, mindful of. They can be vigilant, but they can also be hyper vigilant. So, and there's a different. I mean, it's a bit like anxiety and phobia. It's okay to be anxious about things, but when you've got a phobia, it just prevents you from doing anything. And in relation to trauma, where you're vigilant, where you're not going to let it happen to you again, that's a good thing necessarily. But when you're hyper vigilant and you don't allow yourself to have any pleasure or any contact with people or to do anything at all because you could put yourself at risk, that's when it becomes a bit problematic.
Terry, I have a saying: when you're anxious, it shows you care. Whereas, and there's a level of care because the anxiety, and that's a good anxiety to have because to me it's a positive, and I don't take that as a negative to be anxious. So when I say to my staff sometimes, or had said to staff in the past, that shows to me that you care. You care about your job. You care about the outputs. You care about the timing. You care about everything. And you turn the negative into a positive.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Another one was there's a friend of mine that's whose family member, her father actually was part of the Christchurch massacre. Yeah, so unfortunately, it affected her severely. Obviously, and since then, like, she's normally a forgiving person, but she's generally a good person at heart, but she just obviously could never forgive someone like that, obviously. The terrorist himself. So anyway, it was a really bad, it was a very difficult situation for her. But yeah, so in saying that, it took her a very long time to overcome the trauma of that. But she managed to, see like Herc said, there's always the positive in the negative. And, how she did it, I can't imagine how she would have done that, but she managed to over time, and she would, she's able to bring herself, she's become a stronger person at this stage. And so she's, it changes people in a positive way. Anyway.
Well, sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's not so positive. There's a whole lot of stuff we could unravel around the Christchurch massacre. There are people who have forgiven, or forgiven's probably not the right word, but have forgiven and moved on as much as they can, because they wouldn't be able to live their life if they don't do that. There's a lot of people who've been the victims of the murder of a loved one, who've forgiven the murderer so that that person's not in their life, is not eating away at them all the time. And the other part of that is that you go to a place of worship, you're expecting it to be a safe place. So if your place of worship is a place that you've always gone to and it's always been safe, it's been a place for you to reflect and to praise your higher being, whatever the higher being may be, when that becomes a place of mass murder and destruction, that shadows a whole lot of other layers of safety. So it's terrible on a whole lot of levels. Port Arthur, people went there expecting they were going to a tourist spot and having a nice meal in the cafe or whatever. They certainly weren't expecting to die or to witness people dying on that day. So same sort of context of it happens in a place where you weren't expecting it to happen. I mean, if you're in a war zone, you expect that there might happen. It still doesn't make the trauma any easier, but sometimes it gives us a context. It could be single or multiple events. I mean, obviously in a war zone, you're probably going to have multiple traumatic events. In a violent family, you're going to have multiple traumatic events. Some people end up in more than one accident, for instance. Students I used to have in Canberra had to write their autobiography, which was about how their values and attitudes became shaped by the world around them in terms of the media, their family, friends, peers, etc. And a number of women would often disclose their sexual assault episodes in that, and domestic violence in that essay, and some of the stories that I heard from people in those autobiographies were eye-opening in terms of just how prevalent sexual assault is, just how prevalent family violence is. One woman, I'll give you two quick stories on this. One woman was an older woman who would have married probably around just in the early 50s probably. And she was a Catholic and her husband wasn't, and he promised that he would go to church with her if she married him. And I think for the first week, or before they got married, he used to drive to church and wait for her at the front. As soon as they got married, that behaviour stopped. So she couldn't go to church, and she felt very guilty about that. That was one of many things that he did, but that was the one that sort of she felt he'd broken a promise, and that led to further trauma. But the one that stands out probably the most is a young woman who had been sexually assaulted systematically as a child, and then had been raped, gang raped when she was about 15, and then raped again when she was about 17. So she'd had several experiences of that sort of trauma. Obviously, that led to lots of issues. She had what we now call associative disorder, but at that time we called it multiple personality disorder, where she would go into different personalities, and she was working through that really well. And at one point she sent cards to everybody who kept her alive. On her birthday she sent us a card. I've still got the card that said, you know, you're one of the people who kept me alive for the last year, so I'm writing to say thank you. So that was the nicest card I ever got. But she had clearly had a lot of trauma in her life. And there's some evidence to suggest that people, you know, with associative disorder are leaving their body to get away from bad things that are happening to them at the time. That's, for some, that's a slightly controversial theory, but there is some evidence, or certainly anecdotal evidence, of that happening. It's the multiple impacts of interpersonal trauma and violence, including those on a person's psyche and their sense of self. So you start to question your sense of self. You start to question, why is this happening to me? Is there a reason that I'm getting picked on? Is there a reason I'm being victimised or harassed, or having more accidents than other people? You start to question a lot of things. We see, as a society, we generally see trauma as unusually intensive and unwanted experience that has an actual perceived danger to oneself or another. So we see it as an unwanted and intense experience. So, but what's intense to one person, as I said before, is not as intense to somebody else. And what is seen as being least intense for somebody is intense for somebody. So there is a personal level of how intense you feel, but obviously some things we recognise as being very intense, such as the bushfires, such as violence, including murder, such as the Christchurch massacres. Trauma shapes and informs our interactions with ourselves and others. So if we've been traumatised, it's going to shape the way that we see the world, how much trust we place in others. Certainly childhood trauma can impact on adult relationships, and unless we work through that, we can be less trusting and not let people in. We don't allow ourselves to be vulnerable. If you have more time, I'd show you the Brene Brown talk on vulnerability, but I would recommend that you watch it. It's a TED talk on vulnerability. It goes for about 20 minutes, and it's very much about having the courage to allow ourselves to let people in, to be loved, and to say that you're enough, and to prosper and grow by not having to control everything. I'll give you the link for that at some point. So if you're interested in watching it, you can. Interpersonal violence or trauma effects often occurs in secrecy. Survivors often struggle to have their experiences validated. It could occur in the context of interpersonal violence, covert or overt, so openly or closed, and can lead to complex and chronic psychological and physiological injuries. So the person may receive physical injuries in terms of broken bones, bruises, damaged organs, etc. But they can also experience the psychological impacts of who did it to them and how it happened, etc. It can lead to mental illness. It can lead to people not being well adjusted. The violence could be from partners. It could be from siblings. Could be from parents. It could be from uncles. Sexual assault can happen with extended family as much as more than it happens with strangers, for instance, maybe neighbours. So often in interpersonal violence, often the person is known to us, and that makes the trauma much harder when we know the person. It's very hard to comprehend when that happens. But if we go back to the Christchurch massacres for a minute, it's also very hard to comprehend how anybody could do that to people they don't know. Sometimes we think when somebody murders somebody, it's a crime of passion. But when it's a cold-blooded killing like happened in Christchurch, mass killings, it doesn't make a lot of sense for people and in terms of trying to process that. So that's another context as well. Okay, so some of the reactions to trauma during trauma, our emotional responses could be shock, and people react in various different ways in terms of shock. An initial shock reaction person might look like they're in control, or they may be shaking. They may be talking gobbledygook. They may totally sound like they've lost the plot. They could be panicked. They have high anxiety. They might be emotionally numb, so they're not feeling anything at all, or they look like they're not feeling anything at all. They could be stunned. They could be in denial. They could be dissociated. They could be a little bit like emotionally numb, but in terms of what they're saying and in terms of what they're doing, they're all over the shop. They could be dazed. They could be apathetic. They look like they don't care. They may have a feeling of unreality. They may be just removed from the actual situation, almost as if they're not wanting to process it. And that's often a safety mechanism. It could be fearful, could be hopeless, could sense some emptiness. They could be angry or hostile. They could go into a rage. They can certainly have a lot of grief, and they have a lot of guilt. Now, and guilt can play out if you're the person who survived and the other person died, then there can be a lot of guilt. We have a case study we use at Community Services around a father surviving a car crash and his wife and son die, and then he has to live with the daughter who wasn't on the car trip. One of the issues he's obviously processing in that is the guilt of him and the car trip, as to whether they should have gone by plane or whether he should have been driving or whether they should have had more stops, or a whole range of different ways that plays out, and then feeling that his daughter is not going to forgive him because he survived and the others didn't, etc. That's a role play, but there's it's also happens in real life, where people feel responsible and feel why did I survive and they didn't survive, for instance. Why is this happening to me? So people might have impaired concentration. They might be confused and disoriented. They might have difficulty making decisions, a poor attention span. They might be vulnerable. They might be forgetful. They might be hypervigilant. They might be watching everything that happens. When an infant is experiencing family violence in front of them, then they have a thing called frozen watchfulness, which is if they're in the high chair, their eyes are just frozen, wondering what's going to happen next, almost like where's the next missile coming from. It's just really quite scary when you see it. But that is hypervigilance. It's where a person is absolutely hyper alert to everything that's happening around them and is responding very quickly. The thoughts of the events might pervade everything they're doing, might be continually thinking about what's happened. They might fear losing control. Withdrawal is a behavioural response. They may regress. And regressive behaviours might mean the person goes back to a previous time and might go back to when they were much younger. I had a child in care who was 6, was left by his mother on the train station with his father, who'd spent 15 minutes of his life out of jail. So the child literally didn't know his father, and part of that 15 minutes was 5 minutes on the train station where the mother said, "Oh, here you go, here's your son, you have him." He had a new partner. Within half a day, that child had his father had his hands around his throat, up against the wall, saying, "You're going to school," because the little boy said, "No, I'm not going to school." That became a problem. He wanted. I just got a message about your after hours class, which won't be happening at 5:30, but that's okay. I gather you guys weren't going to be hanging on, given the small numbers tonight anyway, so we'll rearrange that. So sorry to interrupt myself mid-speech, but that email just came through. I thought it was important. So he went to a foster placement. The new step, the father's new de facto, her parents, her mother and her new boyfriend wanted to take care of this child, and I said, "Look, we'll have to check you out like we would any potential foster placement. You have no real relationship to the child. You've only just met him a couple of hours before we have as his district officers. Is there anything we should know?" And she said, "No, nothing." Turned out that he had 33 assault charges, so we didn't think it was appropriate to place that child with him. But we put this child in care, and every time his mother rang, he would regress to a baby and would say things like, how many mornings, because she would promise to come and see him and then not come. So he would regress literally in front of your eyes, with behaviour that went back to a previous time, like a younger age. There's also a scene in Queer as Folk in the American version, where a couple adopt an adolescent boy who has been a sex worker, and he goes back on the street, and they try to. He has contact with his mother, and he regresses as well. So there's a really good scene in that where he just goes back to being a little boy. Literally within a matter of seconds during this conversation, you see him change. It's really well acted. But that's exactly what regressive behaviour is. The person goes back to a previous time. When I was caring for my father, I went back to some of my adolescent behaviours in his presence, which I not realised I was doing at first. So we can be triggered by events. We can end up regressing to previous behaviours if we aren't aware of what we're doing. Non-communication, changes in speech patterns. We can become impulsive. Shopping, for instance, would be one of those, or lashing out at people. Erratic movements, walking aimlessly, and even whistling aimlessly, like walking and whistling without any intent or purpose. Aimless walking, pacing, fidgeting, exaggerated style of responses, and antisocial behaviour. How are we going? You need a break, or are you right to keep going?
I'm happy.
I'm happy to.
Sorry, happy to keep going? Yep.
Yes, please.
No worries. All right. Well, we'll probably go through for another 20 minutes or so, and then I'll let you go. So we're having a break. So just repeating the message I got during when I was talking there. There's no support after tonight. Kylie's in a board meeting, but she's happy to start it after next Wednesday's class. But she's also happy to give individual support through email, and I'll post her email address at the end of the session. So if you want to get in contact, you can.
So who receive the assessments, by the way?
I imagine they're going to Kylie. I'll check that.
Kylie? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And I'm happy. I mean, you can also contact me if you've got a question about the assessment, because I'm happy to give you some guidance. Physiological responses, so physical responses, body responses, tachycardia, so irregular fast heartbeat, hypertension, high blood pressure, dyspnea, which is irregular breathing, hyperventilation, and when people have a panic attack, they hyperventilate. What do you do if somebody's hyperventilating? What's the best strategy?
Tell them to calm down and blow into a
brown paper bag. Probably doesn't have to be brown, but yes, blow into a bag. Calm down. Help them. Well, I mean, mirror the behaviour you want. So if you control your breathing, then that's more likely they'll control their breathing. If you're calm, they're more likely to be calm. But yeah, definitely the paper bag. If you want to change your anxiety, going back to your point before, Hercules, about anxiety, it is important that you have a certain level of performance anxiety, otherwise you won't perform. That if it's too low, then you'll have a flat performance. If it's too high, then you'll be too nervous. But if you have the right level of anxiety, then you'll do a good job. So anxiety is, as you say, not a bad thing to a certain level, but where somebody has got to a point of hyperventilation, you need to bring them back. One of the things with that is if you want to increase the oxygen in your blood and change your mindset and stop having a panic attack or stop being stressed, if you take a deep breath from your belly button or the base of your spine and you take it and you hold it, which is where the count to 10 stuff comes from, but really it's about taking a deep breath, a proper deep breath, and holding it for up to 10 and then letting it out slowly. That will change your blood pressure, so it can stop you hyperventilating. It will also change your mood and your perception of what's happening. But if you want to hyperventilate, if you want to get psyched up before a game of sport, for instance, then if you start panting, you will almost hyperventilate. You'll get yourself into a state. Shock symptoms, so that could be shaking, cold sweats, not sure what's happening around you, chest pains, palpitations, fatigue, fainting, pale appearance, so all the blood can rush from your face and your body. We talked a little bit about that last week when somebody's fearful, which is associated with trauma as well. Cold, clammy skin, increased sweating, thirst, upset tummy, and grinding your teeth. Grinding your teeth is something that I noticed in aged care. When my father was in aged care, he started, towards the end of his life, he started grinding his teeth, which was probably as a result of frustration and not being in control, I guess. But I also had to learn it for acting at one point. It's a way of showing that you're anxious by grinding your teeth or playing with your lip. Complex trauma leads to severe, diverse, and persistent impacts. It's caused by childhood abuse as well as neglect, and it might come from growing up with family violence or dysfunction. But yeah, it's more than one thing. It's over a period of time. It might be from abuse or neglect. It could be from experiencing violence, or it could be from witnessing violence. Why do we make a distinction between witnessing and experiencing? Because some people don't make that distinction. Some people would say it's all experiencing violence, whether you witness it or you live it, whether it happens to you. Some people would say it's all experiencing, but some would make a distinction between witnessing and experiencing. What's the difference there?
So witnessing obviously is just, you know, seeing someone go through the actual whatever victimization, I guess, and the and I guess experiencing would be, you know, being the one
having it happen to you. Yeah. So sometimes in family violence, we only talk about experiencing violence because the child is experiencing it. They have a lived experience of it, rather than they're not. A witness tends to suggest they're outside of the violence, but they're experiencing it. If they're living it, if they're in the house, I would say they're experiencing the violence. I witnessed violence at school. I witnessed somebody having their head beaten against a brick wall outside the library by 3 thugs from that school, and I couldn't do much about that. I was pretty much frozen myself, and I thought I did try to stop it, but I was pretty helpless to stop it. That to me is witnessing violence. If you witness the Christchurch massacres, so there's different levels of witnessing. I witnessed the Lindt siege on TV. Other people would have witnessed the Christchurch massacres live and felt quite hopeless to do anything. Probably they might have been just outside the church, for instance. That would be witnessing violence as well. In terms of within a household, I would suggest that any sort of family abuse where a child is in the house is experiencing violence rather than witnessing violence. I think that's a distinction that I would make, and that's generally a distinction that other people in the industry would make. But there's witnessing, which is seeing it, and there's experiencing, which is living it, essentially. So complex trauma, we know that it affects the brain development, and it affects people's brain size. They have less efficient processing. They have an impaired stress response. They have changes in the gene expression. We know that an infant in the womb, experiences domestic violence when it's happening in the house. That while they're in utero, they are affected by it. There's strong evidence that's been produced to show that. Cognition could have an impaired readiness to learn. They might not be wanting to learn as much. They might not be able to problem solve as well. Language delays. They might not be able to concentrate. They might have poor academic achievement. That would be one of the impacts. Now, having said that, I've got a couple of cousins who are very high achievers, and they both grew up with domestic violence. Their mother left that situation, so they had some positive experiences, but they threw themselves into their studies and their piano and their dancing, and they're both very high achievers in their chosen fields, internationally famous sort of stuff. So there's different ways that plays out. But definitely cognition can be affected. People may not be able to sleep in terms of their physical health, their eating disorders, their poor immune system functioning, cardiovascular disease, and shorter lifespan. All of these things can be impacted by childhood trauma. Emotions, difficult controlling emotions, trouble recognizing emotions, limited coping skills, increased sensitivity to stress, so reacting to smaller things than other people would react to, shame and guilt, excessive worry or hopelessness, worried about not being able to control things more than others would be, worry about the past and the future more than would be normally expected, feelings of helplessness, a lack of self-efficacy, a lack of self-worth, not worthy. Relationships, they might have attachment disorder, problem disorder. They might not be able to form healthy relationships with partners or friends. Poor understanding of social interactions. They might not understand what's required in social settings. They might have problems forming relationships with their peers or romantic relationships or workmates. intergenerational cycles of abuse and neglect. They may become abusive themselves to their children. That's not a given, though. There's probably 1/3 become abusive, 1/3 overcorrect and indulge their children, for instance, and 1/3 vow is never going to happen to their children and become good parents. There's a lot of myths about the cycles of abuse. It's something I would warn against people making assumptions about. It's best to find out from your clients how they're coping. Pardon me. People generally react to trauma. They might. When I was talking about my successful cousins or my cousins' children, you'll also see people who are very successful in the corporate world. I mean, if you listen to their stories, they're often high achievers because they're lacking relationships as a child, or they were abandoned or neglected, or they felt, or they were extremely poor and they don't want to be that poor in their adult life, so that money becomes very important to them. So people can become high achievers as a result of trauma because they, rather than have relationships, they want to make money and be secure with money rather than trust people, I guess is one way to put that. There's a whole range of ways that plays out, not just that one. But mental health, people can be depressed and have anxiety, negative self-image, low self-esteem. They may have what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. After World War I, we used to call it shell shock. We now call it post-traumatic stress disorder. So we've had it for a long time. We just include a lot more things in the category than we used to, and also suicidality. People having suicide ideation or committing suicide, all of that may come from traumatic events. And behaviour, they may have poor self-regulation. They might be up and down. They might have social withdrawal. They might be aggressive, poor impulse control. Whenever I hear about poor impulse control, I'm reminded of a boss I had in child protection. I had a client who sniffed a lot. When he was talking, he used to sniff his nose. And he lived in a caravan to the south coast. He didn't have a lot of money. And my boss at the time said, he must have a cocaine habit. And I thought, this guy doesn't have 2 cents to rub together. He's not going to have a cocaine habit. But she said, he's got low impulse control. She said this while having her 5th cigarette on the balcony because she couldn't go without having a cigarette. And I thought, well, you've got low impulse control. You smoke all the time because you can't stay away from the impulse. You can't control the impulse to smoke. So lots of people have poor impulse control, but it's probably more pronounced in people with childhood trauma. Illegal activity, risk-taking, sexual acting out, particularly if people have been sexually traumatised, becomes something that they can take control of, something they can gain favours with. They can also have a self-esteem issue around their sexuality as a result of what's happened. Adolescent pregnancy, wanting to be loved by the baby that you have, and drug and alcohol use, abuse, misuse, however you want to put that. All right. People can have a loss of safety. They can have a loss of danger cues, so they're not sure what's dangerous and what's not dangerous. Their safety levels may be out of whack. If somebody you trust hurts you, how do you know what is normal? Loss of trust, where the person has been a trusted friend or a family member, then that loss of trust can be significant. Shame. We can talk about shame and guilt to some extent, but shame is huge and it's overwhelming and it debilitates people. They can't move past it. A child getting an exercise wrong at school can trigger the shame. In my case, having my books held up in front of the class to show how bad a writer I was, or how silly I was for writing upside down in my book, or getting the cane for getting one wrong on a spelling test. All that stuff is shame, and you live with that shame unless you've moved past it. And they can affect you having to be right, or having to be not making mistakes as an adult, for instance. Loss of intimacy. People may not be able to have intimate relationships as a result of sexual abuse in their life, or physical abuse and lack of trust. The person may become promiscuous and become, well, the person may use sex, or sex might become a part of their everyday existence, and they may end up with a label of promiscuous, whatever. I mean, there's different ways of perceiving that label. Disassociation. Often to cope with what is happening to the body during the abuse, the child will disassociate. They'll disconnect. So what I was talking about before with dissociative disorder and multiple personality disorder, leaving the body and seeing what's happening without. So moving away from the physical feeling of it can lead to that being a long-term thing. They may have loss of physical connection to the body. They're not really connecting to their body, and they need things like yoga or therapies of getting back in touch with their body and feeling their body and experiencing who they are. They may lose their sense of self, and they may lose their self-worth. They start to feel themselves as dirty and bad, and the childhood dynamic may be reenacted, which could lead to regression, as I said before. And any repeating event will be confirmation that it's still happening to you. So physical brain changes, the smaller brain structures, less brain cells, broken connections between brain cells, so synaptics, biochemicals stop working as well. The brain can't process emotions. It leads to mood disorders and behaviour issues. It lowers the learning ability of the person. They have trouble paying attention, and it lowers behaviour control. And the brain changes make it hard to control impulses, behaviour, and to form relationships. This is a pretty complicated slide. I'll give you a moment to have a look at it, process it. Any questions so far? Any more examples?
Self-reflection can be one of them.
Self-reflection, yeah.
Yeah, like just just sitting on your own and just thinking, writing, writing a diary, that sort of thing.
Yeah. That's a coping mechanism, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I still think it was a symptom or a symbol of trauma. But yeah, self-reflection definitely is a way of me time and reflecting and diarising, journalising. A lot of people write novels because of that. A lot of people are able to process all the trauma that's happened to them by putting it in a diary. There's also a process in Gestalt therapy called ritual burning and letter writing, where you might write a letter to your abuser. And you write down what happened, how you felt about what happened, how you feel about it now. So you were angry, but you have moved on, or you're still angry with them, however you want to word it. But writing that letter allows the person to confront what has happened. I don't think I mentioned in the last class that I did some Gestalt work with some students who were, well, they weren't students, they were counselling course students. I was running counsellor service training for an organisation, and It was a 10-week self-awareness course and then a 6-week, 6-week self-awareness and 10 weeks skills training. And the 6 weeks you had to look inside yourself and see whether you're ready to be a counsellor. And then you or the group decided on who was going on. In the group my group that I trained in, we spent ages working out who would go on, or how we would decide on who would go on, and then we decided we would evaluate ourselves. It was a very interesting experience. But there's the other group at the same time decided that they would decide who went on, and they decided these 2 people wouldn't go on. So we did some gestalt work with them, which was having 2 empty chairs. It's called the empty chair technique, and getting them to say what they wanted to say to the group, which was one chair, and the facilitators, which was the other chair, and what they would say back, what they thought they would say back, and for them to process it. So you can do it as an empty chair or you can do it as letters. But either way, it's a chance to say what you really want to say to that person and put it into a letter. And you can do it in a diary and reflection as well. The thing with a letter is you don't post the letter, you just write it. And in some cases, what people do is they put it into a symbolic mailbox, or they put it onto a bonfire and burn it, and that's why it's called ritual burning. So that's one way of coping or processing. It's a counselling technique essentially. Reflections are good. Coping strategies are around seeking solutions, looking for ways to get past things and move on, anticipate what's coming. So be on top of things, consider your values and beliefs, set your priorities, solve problems, focus on your survival, find the humour. Everybody finds humour in most situations. You can't always find humour in situations, but you'd be surprised at what people find humour in as a way of getting through. And it might be as simple as having not paid the electricity bill or something and finding that humorous given the house is burned down, or pay attention to feelings, share feelings with friends. The more that we're in touch with our feelings, the more that we share those feelings, the less likely they are to be damaging for us. Ask for help, do expressive writing, which is the reflection stuff, and writing letters. Evaluate assumptions. So checking in on, why am I thinking like this? Where is this coming from? This is old stuff. Processing that, your thoughts, and you put it into context. So if you're reacting to something in the current situation and you think, why am I reacting to that? That's not what the person meant. Then you can tap into, well, this is coming from my previous trauma. This is coming from my childhood. This is coming from previous relationships or something. And you can put it into perspective and move past it. Focus on the facts, what's really going on here. Join a group. Therapy groups, self-help groups are very important for helping people process stuff, whether that be sudden infant death syndrome, living with an alcoholic, grief and loss from losing a spouse or a parent or a child to cancer, or to a victim of crime. Take a walk, exercise. When I worked in child protection when I moved to the country, I'd take my dogs for a walk, past cows and sheep and fog and moonlight, and that was the best de-stress available, really, just walking the dogs. Deep breathing, as I said, I did a whole weekend of deep breathing, and it certainly can change the way that you act and interact. It can change your whole mindset. You can relax, meditate, be mindful, let go, eat good food, get enough sleep. Again, we go back to mental health. We go back to eating good food and getting enough sleep. Not always easy to do if you're traumatized. Stay in the moment, soothe yourself, find acceptance, and forgive yourself or forgive others, and seek solutions that are going to work. The things in the middle are the things that keep us back, our feelings and our negative coping, creates problems. So, the trigger or trauma, It should be or, not of. It's normal to feel upset, anxious, or extremely uncomfortable when you encounter difficult content. Having a strong reaction is normal, and learning to regulate is part of normal emotional development. So watching something that's upsetting us and processing that and taking a deep breath, that's acceptable behaviour. That's understandable, and it's a way of us being able to be strong. Trauma triggers, though, are different. They often include a loss of a person's sense of time, space, or self. They can lose periods of time. I was talking to a guy in Tasmania at one point when I was there for a conference, and we were sharing that we can lose track of time, but I meant for like 30 seconds. He meant for 15 minutes, half an hour, a couple of hours. He had depression, and he would just zone out and not know where the time went, quite literally. So it's amplified. The emotion's amplified, or it might be totally muffled, and the person is extremely numb. And the emotions don't always match what's happening. They are linked to a previous event. Triggers are like a trapdoor in the brain, and can fall through. So triggers can be things like they can be physical, they can be sensory, they can be olfactory. So they can be touch, smell, taste, sound, voice, appearance. I was watching Louis Theroux talk to a rape victim from Yale University last night, and she said that after she was raped by a male friend, she's very tall, but he was a very big man. She was any big person she saw after, any big male she saw after that, she immediately thought it was him, and she would freeze. She has since processed that, but that's an example of a trigger. I had a student in Canberra who was triggered by one of the men in the room, one of the students' aftershave, because her abuser had worn the same aftershave. I've just mentioned walking the dogs when I lived in the country. I used to spend my holidays at my aunt and uncle's dairy farm. And when I was walking the dogs, there was a dairy farm just up the road from where I was living. And all of those smells triggered happy memories for me. I didn't have trauma from the dairy farm, but smells, voices, actions can all trigger an event. So you might say something and your client will be triggered because you sound like their father, for instance. Any experience of that or any comments on that?
Can places be trigger?
Absolutely. Or even places look like it. Sorry, go on.
One of the participants, once he go past to his primary school, he getting triggered because he has bad experience.
Yeah. So the physical place absolutely can be a trigger. So I was driving home. This is not trauma, but it's about triggers. I was driving home from work at Macquarie Fields. I was on King George's Road, and the radio played, and Arla Jones. Arla Jones was touring here as a Welsh singer. He'd been a boy soprano, and is now a male, a professional opera singer. And they played one of my father's favourite songs, and at about the same time I drove past Roselands, which is where I saw The Love Bug with my father, and I swear he enjoyed that movie more than I did. I enjoyed it, but he was laughing his head off. So that was a trigger from the building at the same time as the radio, so it was like a double trigger. I had a student in Canberra. We were doing a similar course to this, but for youth justice workers working in a detention centre. And we ran the orientation session in one of the classrooms at the campus in Phillip in Canberra. And this guy had his arms folded for the whole session and he was so tense. And somebody asked him what was happening, and he said, This is my high school. This was the detention room, and this is where I spent most of my high school, was in this detention room being in trouble. So all of the learning that was going on that day, all the information about the course was going in one ear and out the other, because he was back reliving that room from when he was 14 or 15 or 16. The same as your client going past the primary school, but it could even be a building that looks like the primary school. So you might be in a different area, but the school looks exactly the same. That could also be a trigger. Any other comments or thoughts?
Oh, without doubt, I'm sure that each one of us have had some sort of trigger of some form, whether it's, sight, smell, taste, whatever the case may be, location in our lives, whether potentially it's either negative or positive. And I suppose it's the one that's more impactful rather than, it's the case of always trauma. It could be the positive side, or conversely, it is the trauma. It's what, Muhammad just said, a particular participant drives past the school and, that just sends him Burko because, maybe what the abuse or the, whatever it was that, occurred at school.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, and the reason I gave you the positive triggers as well as the negative triggers is that a trigger is a trigger. And there are times when it's positive and there are times when it's negative. With a client, either of those are important to acknowledge and be on top of. If you've positively triggered them, then they're tapping into something other than you. They're tapping into a previous experience. So it's not about you. And if it's negative, it's important to realise that could happen. You've done nothing necessarily wrong, but you've re-traumatized somebody through a trigger. Now, you had no idea it was a trigger necessarily, but once you know it's a trigger, you need to control it. Now that you know that primary school is a trigger for your client, then you have to think of a different route, or help him to process that if you can. But certainly we need to be mindful of when we're re-traumatizing people through triggers, because triggers are just that. They're going to lead the person into a bad place. And if a person's having therapy, then they need to process that. I had a student who worked at a women's refuge, and she had to transport a client to and from her counselling sessions. And we were talking about Gestalt, similar to what we were talking about earlier on tonight. And the counsellor had taken her, she had regressed during the therapy session, and rather than the counsellor bring her out of that properly, she was still in that when she was taken back to the refuge by the worker. So that was very traumatic for the worker, because she wasn't able to deal with that. So we need to be mindful of triggers. I'll leave it at that for today, unless you've got other questions. We'll come back. We've got another 12 or so slides to do. We've got a bit more discussion, and we can get stuck into your assessment next week. So questions or comments or other things we want to share?